Number one, 4x times x minus 5 equals 0. And one thing that's going to be important in this section is anytime you're multiplying two things, in this case, two parentheses, if you're multiplying two things and they equal 0, you know that one of those two things has to be 0. So in this case, either 4x equals 0, that first parentheses, or x minus 5 equals 0. If you're multiplying two parentheses equal to 0, it's fairly simple to solve. So 4x equals 0, you're just going to work that out, divide by 4. And we get x equals 0, so one answer there. And then on the right, just working to get x by itself, so we're going to add 5. And we've got x equals 5. Second example, pretty much the same thing. We've got 5x plus 8 times x plus 5 equals 0. So again, we've got one parentheses times another parentheses equal to 0. So two things multiplying to be 0. So either 5x plus 8 is 0, or x plus 5 equals 0. So we're going to work out both of those algebraically. Subtract 8 on both sides here. Got 5x equals negative 8. Divide by 5. Okay, so that'll be your first answer. Subtract 5 on the next one. And we've got x equals negative 5. So two answers on both, on number 1 and number 2. Number 3, x plus 4 times x plus 18 equals negative 49. And you'll want to notice, unlike the first two, this one is not equal to 0. So we can't say x plus 4 equals 0, x plus 18 equals 0, because these two parentheses don't multiply to be 0. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to start off by foiling these parentheses on the left. We're going to take the first times the first, the outer numbers, the inner numbers, and then last numbers, all multiplying by each other. So we'll work that out, and then we'll set it equal to 0. So that negative 49 that's on the right, we're ultimately going to move that back over to the left. So going to start off with that multiplication, x times x, x times 18. On the inside, 4 times x, and then 4 times 18 equals negative 49. And at this point, we want to put together like terms, and I'm also going to set this equal to 0. So we've got x squared plus 22x plus 72. And then if we're going to bring that 49 over, we've got to add 49 in order to do that. So we're going to end up with 0 on the right side. So x squared plus 22x plus 121 equals 0. Then what you'll want to do is factor. We've got a trinomial here on the left, x squared plus 22x plus 121. Trinomials are going to factor into two parentheses. The first thing in both those parentheses has got to multiply to be x squared. Usually the easiest part, it's going to be x and x. We also have plus and plus in the middle there, so we can assume plus is in the middle of both of those parentheses. And then lastly, you need two things that multiply to be 121 and that add to be 22 here. So two things that multiply to be 121. Hopefully you guys know this. 11 and 11 multiply to be 121, and they also add to be 22. So once you've gotten to this point, then we're at a similar situation to what we had on the first and second examples, where you've got two parentheses equal to 0. And by the way, on some of these, they're going to ask you for a step 1 answer. And this, when you've got equal to 0, this is actually going to be your step 1. And the instructions for that will say something like using the standard form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, ... Basically, they're just asking you for the factored version on the left. So this would be the answer to all that. So step 1, and then your step 2 is just doing what we did on those first 2 examples, x plus 11 equals 0. And then normally if these were different, you would write x plus 11 equals 0 or whatever's in the other parentheses equals 0. But since these are both the same, you can get away with just saying x plus 11 equals 0, and solving that will end up with one answer. Okay, and that'll be step 2. Number 4, 5x squared equals 13x minus 6. I'm going to start off by setting this equal to 0. And in this case, we're going to move everything to the x squared side. The x squared here, we want to move everything to its side. So the 13x that's on the right of the equal sign, we're going to move to the left. The negative 6, we're going to move to the left also. So subtracting 13x, adding 6. So on the left, we've got 5x squared minus 13x plus 6 equals, on the right, everything canceled out, so we've just got 0 there. And then just like on the last problem, once you've set it equal to 0, we want to factor this. We've got a trinomial on the left. It's going to factor into 2 parentheses. First thing in both those parentheses has to multiply to be the first thing there, the beginning term on the trinomial. So you know you're going to have x and x to make that x squared. And the nice thing about 5 is that it's prime. So the only pair of numbers that you can multiply to make 5 is just 5 and 1. Another thing here too, we've got a plus on the end. If this had been plus and then plus there, you could go ahead and put pluses in. But it has to multiply to be positive, and in this case, add to negative. So the only way you can multiply to be positive is if they're both positive, or if they're both negative. And since they add to be this negative here, they can't both be positive. They have to both be negative. Okay, and then the last 2 numbers there have to multiply to be this positive 6. And since we've got a 5 at the front of this trinomial, we're not looking for a pair that multiplies to be 6 and adds to be negative 13. We're actually going to plug in the numbers that multiply to be 6 and then see if we can check it and to see if it works out. So things that multiply to be 6, 3 and 2. And if you check this, we'll do this by multiplying these numbers underneath. Negative 3 times 1 gives you negative 3. 5 and negative 2 gives you negative 10. And these are the ones that we want to add to be negative 13. If we didn't get this number, you might go back and switch the 3 and the 2, because we could have put the 2 here and then the 3 here. That would have given us a different pair of numbers underneath. But again, if this doesn't work out, swap the 3 and the 2. And then from there, you've got parentheses equal to 0. And by the way, once you've factored this, this will be your step 1. That standard form, all that language about standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, all that stuff. So enter in just what's left of the equal sign. And by the way, when you've got 1x in that second parentheses, leave the 1 off when you enter that in the computer. So that's your step 1. Step 2, we're just solving these. 5x minus 3 equals 0, or that 1x minus 2 equals 0. So we get x equals 3/5. Add 2 here. And we get x equals 2. Number 5, 6x squared minus 5x minus 7 equals negative 8. So we're going to start off just like on the last problem, setting it equal to 0. Going to move everything to the x squared side, so the only thing we have to do is move that 8. Negative 7 plus 8 is positive 1 equals 0. Then we want to factor. Trinomials will factor into 2 parentheses equal to 0. First thing in both those parentheses has to be the 6x squared. So we know we'll have an x and an x. And for the 6 part, the 6 could be a few different things. That could be 1 and 6, could be 2 and 3. I'm going to go ahead and go with the 2 and the 3 just to start with. If that doesn't work, we'll move on to the 1 and the 6. And another thing here, the signs in the middle have to multiply to be positive and then add to be negative. So these are going to have to both be negative. Negative and negative multiplies to positive, and it'll give us this minus here in the middle. Last two things in both those have to multiply to be 1. So that has to be 1 and 1. And you will want to check this once you get these numbers in here. So underneath, negative 1 times 3. And then on the outside, 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And we want this to add to be this middle number here, negative 5, which it does. So once you've got that factored correctly, this is going to be your step 1. And then solving it's just like what we've been doing. 2x minus 1 equals 0, or 3x minus 1 equals 0. So x equals 1/2. And x equals 1/3. So your step 1 answer up above, and then your step 2 answers down below. And by the way, when you enter those step 2 answers in, you'll just put in 1/2, comma, 1/3. Just separate both answers with a comma. Number 6, negative 18x squared equals 8x. So we'll start off by setting this equal to 0. Move that 8x over. So after we've set it equal to 0 on all these, we'll want to factor next. And you'll notice this example has a binomial on the left. It's just got 2 terms instead of the 3 terms that we've been having. So just 2 terms here. The binomials are going to factor just a little bit differently. Either, so I'll write this on the side, binomials, either there's going to be a greatest common factor, something that you can take out of both terms, like in this case, the 18 and the 8, we can take a 2 out of both of those. Also here we've got an x in both terms, so you can take out a 2, you can take out an x. If that hadn't worked, we'll also see some examples of difference of squares, and we'll look at that in the next example. But for here, got a greatest common factor, so you'd want to take out a 2 and an x. And I usually recommend, if you've got a negative at the start of something that you're factoring, factor out a negative, so negative 2x. And then if you take negative 2 out of 18, that leaves 9. You can also think of this as division. Negative 18 divided by negative 2 is going to be positive 9. We took out one of the x's, so that leaves 1 there. And then if you do negative 8 divided by negative 2, you actually get a positive 4. Since that x is taken out, there's no x attached to the 4, equals 0. And then that's the factored version. That'll be step 1. Step 2, we're separating these out. Negative 2x equals 0, or 9x plus 4 equals 0. Divide negative 2. X equals 0 divided by anything is just 0. On the right, subtract 4. Divide 9. X equals negative 4/9. Number 7, 9x squared equals 64. Start out setting it equal to 0. We want to move that 64 to the 9x squared side. So subtract that, and then we've got 9x squared minus 64 equals 0 on the right side. So again, we'll want to factor. We've got a binomial here. So with these ones that come up in this section, check greatest common factor. 9 and 64 don't have anything in common. So no greatest common factor. It is, though, difference of squares. Difference of squares, the formula for that is a minus b, a plus b. And the thing that you'll want to know about that is a is the square root of the first term. So if we look at the 9x squared, we want a to be the square root of that. Square root of 9, hopefully you guys know, is 3. And the square root of x squared is just x. B is the square root of the second term. So the square root of 64 is 8. So as long as you can work out what a is, you can work out what b is. Solving difference of squares or factoring difference of squares is not really that complicated. So we've got 3x minus 8. In other words, a minus b. And then we're doing a plus b. And then be careful you don't forget your equals 0 part. Not quite done yet, but that's our step 1 answer. And then step 2 is going to involve setting both of those parentheses equal to 0. And then working them out. So add 8. 3x equals 8. Divide by 3. X equals 8/3. Subtract 8 there. 0 minus 8 is negative 8. Divide 3. X equals negative 8/3. All right, so step 1, answer 3x minus 8 times 3x plus 8. And step 2 answer 8/3 comma, negative 8 thirds.